What's going on, everybody? So, meaning to make this video for about a week, but haven't really had much time. But today I have some time, so we're gonna get around to it. So back in 2008, Dead Space came out. The original Dead Space, one of my favorite horror games of all time. It got a couple sequels, it got a couple spin-offs, and then the series just went dormant because Dead Space 3 didn't do so well. So in around 2020, the guys who created Dead Space announced they were making a new horror game, the Callisto Protocol. Which I was like, oh wow, like a spiritual successor to Dead Space, that's cool. Then in 2021, they announced they were making a remake of Dead Space. So, we got two games right here. One spiritual successor, one direct remake of Dead Space. Awesome. And they came out within a month of each other. So, Callisto came out in December 2022. This came out in January 2023. It's basically brand new. So, I have played through both. And I wanted to do a comparison video between each. So, for those of you who don't know, Dead Space was a survival horror game released in 2008. And it was, it took place on a spaceship, the USG Ishimura. And, you will get there and all hell breaks loose, right? What was funny is when they were originally making it, the guy who created Glenn Schofield, his first idea was a prison game set in space. He never let go of that idea. So, like when I first read about the Callisto Protocol, I was like, okay, so that's what... This was his original idea setting for Dead Space. So that's cool. So in Dead Space, you play as Isaac Clarke. In Callisto Protocol, you play as Jacob Lee. His name is Jacob because Jacob's the son of Isaac in the Bible, apparently. I don't know, I'm not religious, but apparently that's why they named Jacob, because Isaac was Isaac in Dead Space. Because they're meant to be connected. Hello, buddy. So, we'll talk about the Callisto Protocol first because that came out first. Callisto Protocol takes place on Black Iron Prison on the dead moon of, I think it's Jupiter. Jupiter's dead moon. Yep. I think it's called Callisto. I don't know. Jupiter's dead moon. I guess I imagine it's called Callisto. The game's called the Callisto Protocol. And it's got infected by this outbreak called the biophage, which is turning all these people into monsters, zombies, zombie-like things. In Dead Space, you're on the USG Ishimura, and a spaceship, and the crew has been turned into necromorphs, which are, oh my god, some of the grotesque enemies in game history. So right off the bat, I'm going to say this. The biophage enemies are kind of boring. None of them really stood out to me. I don't know what any of them are called, and they kind of just look like generic zombies, except for like one, which has two heads. The necromorphs, on the other hand, wow. They're frightening, and they're disgusting, and they are messed up. Like, I would not want to be turned into one of those things. And they're also probably a lot more deadly, and I'll get to that. But in just terms of enemies right off the bat, Dead Space, I think, has the much better enemies because the necromorphs are so much more memorable than the biophage. Now, in terms of the setting, one isn't really better than the other here. The Black Iron Prison is actually pretty cool looking. I'm not gonna lie to you. I do like the areas you go to. I do like how it's designed. Ishimura is great too. Don't get me wrong. But you're not just on the Ishimura the whole time. There are 2 points where you actually leave the Ishimura. So there's a little more variety in Dead Space. But the Black Iron Prison is actually a pretty cool place to travel through. It's not boring or anything. It's actually nice looking. It's varied. So they're even on that one, right? Graphically, though, they both look fantastic, right? But I gotta be honest, Callisto Protocol does look a little bit better than Dead Space. It's just Callisto Protocol graphically is superior, and it's not like way superior, but it is a little bit superior. In terms of art design, though, I do think Dead Space is better. I like the creature designs better. I like the suit designs better. I like the weapon designs better. But there's an art direction, I think Dead Space. There's a pure graphics, then Callisto's got it. In terms of story, this isn't even a contest. Dead Space wins hands down. Dead Space actually has one of the best survival horror stories ever in a video game, and one day I'm gonna do a full review of Dead Space. Callisto Protocol doesn't have a bad story necessarily, but it's very much generic sci-fi horror tropes. And it does use those tropes well to its defense, but it doesn't tell a very original, compelling story like Dead Space does. Circling it back, let's go to the cast. We're going to mainly focus on the two main characters here. If this were Callisto Protocol versus Dead Space original, Callisto would win. Because Isaac in the original Dead Space was just not a character. He was just there. In the remake, he's voiced by Gunnar Wright, who voiced him in 2 and 3. So he actually has a personality now. And I find Isaac to be a lot more compelling than Jacob. Jacob's not a bad character or anything. He was trying to do something good and ended up doing something bad, and he didn't know it. And he feels guilty about it. He tries to redeem himself. He's not a bad character. I prefer Isaac, though. Isaac's motivation for being on the Ishimura makes a lot more sense, and his story is a lot more believable. And they actually add a lot to Isaac's story in the remake. Jacob's not a bad character, though, and I do like the ending. I do like how he ends the storyline. But I think in just terms of characters, Isaac is a more compelling character than Callisto. Than Jacob from Callisto. But you do see Jacob's face a lot more because Isaac's in his engineering rig most of the game, so he always has helmet on, whereas Jacob doesn't have a helmet really. He has like an oxygen mask that he wears, but you always see him. He doesn't have like this really cool armor that Isaac does. So keep that in mind. That doesn't really affect anything, but in terms of character, I like characters who wear armor. I think it's cool, but Jacob has his face out all the time. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. Like Resident Evil does that too. A lot of games just have the guy's face there. So, soundtrack, Dead Space. I actually remember Dead Space's music. Now, in terms of gameplay, this is where... Because if you're doing the count right now, Callisto's only one in one category, which is graphics. So this could dramatically switch it in Callisto's favor. We'll get there. So, in terms of the combat system, they're both, despite Callisto's supposed to be a spiritual successor to Dead Space, they don't really play anything alike. They have similar mechanics, like the health system being on your back. That's similar. No HUD really. Just is the same in both games. The Dead Space one, the HUD, the health system is is along your whole spine. In Callisto, it's just on your neck. It's a little smaller, but it's actually, you can notice it. It's not hard. In terms of strictly just talking about the health, the healing system is a lot faster in Dead Space. You just press a button and it's done. In Callisto, you have to hold the down button on your D-pad if you're playing the PlayStation 5 version, and he has to like slowly inject his neck with a health injector. It kind of sucks. It takes a little while, but you can manage. You just make sure you're away from enemies. They both have a kinesis system. Callisto's is a lot more broken, though, because you can just grab living things and throw them into spikes. Dead Spaces, you can lift up dead things, but it's also infinite, whereas Callisto's has a battery you gotta use. What Callisto does not have is the stasis. which Isaac can use to slow down enemies and objects, but you never need that in Callisto, but it's just an extra mechanic Dead Space has. The biggest difference between the two games is the combat system. They still have gunplay, but Callisto's gunplay is very much, you don't only really need it for like a boss fight. You can use it if you want to, but most of Callisto's core gameplay comes from its melee combat, which is... How do I put this gently? It's kind of... It's like you're playing Punch-Out with zombies and a stun baton. Because you have a dodge mechanic, you gotta dodge, wait for them to finish their combos, and then you can hit them. And it never really feels great. The entire playthrough, I always felt it was really clunky. And there's stealth sections too, which, okay, whatever. But I always thought the gameplay was a lot clunkier than it should have been. Look, having a melee-based combat system is fine, but make it fluid and enjoyable, whereas this one is very animation-heavy, and if you're in the middle of an animation, you're screwed. Because, like, you can't counter, you can't move, you can't blah, blah, blah. So, it's very clunky. And it doesn't work for crowd control. If you have more than 2 enemies on the screen, you're fucked. Because melee combat is not great. There was one section where I died, I think, like 7 times. Because I just kept getting cornered, and the game forced me into melee, and I just couldn't get out. So eventually I just had to stay back and just pop everyone. And then a boss showed up. But the boss is a lot easier than the crowd of enemies. Dead Space has the over-the-shoulder shooting mechanic that started in Resident Evil 4. The difference here is that you have to target the enemy's limbs and chop them to pieces. However, Dead Space's combat feels incredibly satisfying, and it's a lot more fun to do. Because you always feel like, okay, I can manage. You can play through this game with one gun if you really wanted to. I've done it. I got the achievement for it. But there's also a lot more weapons in Dead Space. There's like 5 in Callisto. 2 of them are shotguns. Dead Space, you've got the plasma cutter, the pulse rifle, the force gun, the contact beam, the line gun, the ripper, the flamethrower, and the hand cannon if you beat the game on impossible mode. I think that's all of them. Pretty sure that's all. Anyway, I think that's all of them. But you have a lot more variety of weapons you can use, and the combat feels incredibly rewarding and satisfying in Dead Space. In Callisto, it feels like a chore, to be honest with you. And I wish it didn't, because I was actually really excited for Callisto Protocol. And I didn't hate my time with it, if I'm honest. I'm actually glad I played it. But if you're just going to compare Callisto Protocol to Dead Space, if you can only get one, you're definitely going to want to get Dead Space over Callisto Protocol, in my opinion. Callisto's not terrible. Like, I really do think if you're a survival horror fan, you should give it a shot. It's not a bad game. It's not amazing. Like, it's a perfectly playable 6 out of 10 game. If you can get it on sale for like $40-$30, go for it. Dead Space, you could definitely buy at full price and don't feel like you got ripped off. I'm glad Dead Space is back. And I'm glad that there are 2 games to satisfy your Dead Space needs. But definitely get the Dead Space remake over to Callisto Protocol, in my opinion. I will be doing a full review of Dead Space eventually. I want to go through the whole series. Callisto, I'm not going to do I probably will. I'm going to count that as part of the Dead Space. When I go through the whole Dead Space series, I'll just throw this in there. But I want to do this video first because they're both relevant right now. So, thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more. I'll be back for more videos, maybe not full swing, but I do have some more videos planned for you guys, and hopefully we can get around to doing this more often. Until then, take care.